Imagine for a moment that you are driving to work tomorrow. You hit a pothole that damages your car, or you cross a bridge that has been flagged for urgent repairs. You pay your federal taxes, so you assume that funding for those repairs is secure. But then you learn that a political think tank in Washington has threatened to cut off your state's federal infrastructure money, not because your state is broke, and not because of any law you broke. They threatened to cut off the money simply because your local state senators refused to rig a district map to help a specific candidate win an election. This isn't a hypothetical scenario from a dystopian novel. This is exactly what just played out in the state of Indiana. A massive high-pressure campaign was launched from the Oval Office and its allies against fellow Republicans in the Indiana State Senate. The goal: force them to redraw congressional maps mid-decade, something highly irregular, to squeeze out 2 more seats for the president's party. But when the local lawmakers said no, the tactics shifted from political pressure to what looks a lot like government-sanctioned extortion. We are talking about threats to withhold disaster relief and road funding as punishment for political disobedience. In this video, we are going to break down exactly what happened in this unprecedented clash between state rights and federal power. We will look at the timeline, the specific threats issued by the Heritage Foundation, and the emotional testimony of a state senator who was brought to tears by the intimidation he faced. And we will analyze what this means for the Constitution, because if a president can punish a state financially for not bending the knee, we are in very dangerous territory. I'm Daniel Kershaw, an independent legal and political journalist. I don't work for any party, campaign, or cable network. I just follow the facts, the court documents, and the law. And the question I want you to ask yourself right now is this: if your state's disaster relief funds can be held hostage for a political favor, does your vote at the local level even matter anymore? To understand why this week's events in Indiana are sending shockwaves through the legal community, we have to look at the context. Indiana is not a swing state. It is a solid red state that Donald Trump won by a landslide 3 separate times. The state Senate is controlled by a Republican supermajority. Normally, this is friendly territory, but normal went out the window this week. Here is the legal reality. Redistricting, the drawing of congressional maps, usually happens once every 10 years after the census. We just did this recently. But the push from the White House was to force Indiana to do it again, right now, in the middle of the decade. The goal was purely political: to gerrymander the districts aggressively enough to guarantee 2 extra seats for Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives. Now, legally speaking, mid-decade redistricting is a gray area. It's often challenged in court, and it reeks of political desperation. But that didn't stop the pressure campaign. The president didn't just ask nicely, he demanded it. And when State Senate leader Rod Bray and others signaled that they weren't interested in overturning settled law for a short-term power grab, the reaction from Washington was swift and severe. But what makes this story truly alarming isn't just the request for new maps. It's the weaponization of the federal government that was threatened if they didn't comply. And buried in the chaos of the Oval Office press conference that followed, there is a denial that contradicts every piece of evidence we have. Let's look at the receipts, because in this line of work, documentation is everything. Leading up to the vote, Donald Trump took to Truth Social to launch a direct offensive against his own party members in Indiana. He specifically targeted State Senator Rod Bray, labeling him a rhino, Republican in name only, and essentially putting a political bounty on his head. On November 18th, Trump posted, "I am working with Governor Mike Braun. The governor, a good man, must produce on this, or he will be the only governor, Republican or Democrat, who didn't." He went further, explicitly threatening to endorse primary challengers against anyone who voted no. He wrote, "I will strongly be endorsing against any state senator that votes against the Republican Party." This is standard political hardball. We see this all the time. But then the Heritage Foundation stepped in. For those who don't know, the Heritage Foundation is the architect of Project 2025 and acts as a policy arm for the current MAGA movement. According to reports and statements from lawmakers, Heritage didn't just threaten primary challenges, they threatened the state of Indiana itself. They publicly warned that if the state Senate did not adopt the gerrymandered maps, Indiana would be punished by having federal funding withheld. Let's be clear about what that means. They weren't threatening the politicians' campaign funds. They were threatening your money, taxpayer money for paving roads, money for repairing bridges, money for disaster relief. From a legal perspective, this is deeply troubling. It suggests a view of federal power where taxpayer dollars are not a public trust, but a slush fund to be used to reward loyalty or punish dissent. And it wasn't just outside groups. Take a look at Congressman Marlin Stutzman, a staunch ally of the president representing Indiana. He appeared on CNN with Jake Tapper, and when asked point blank if he supported withholding funds from his own constituents to punish the state legislature, his answer was chilling. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend his state. Instead, he said, "To me, this is a team vote. This is the Republican Party. We're sticking together." He essentially framed the potential financial suffering of Indiana residents as playing hardball. Think about that. An elected official whose salary is paid by taxpayers openly admitting that hurting those taxpayers financially is an acceptable tactic to win a political dispute. Despite this massive coordinated pressure campaign from the president, from Heritage, from J.D. Vance, and from Donald Trump Jr., the Indiana State Senate held a vote, and the result was a stunning rebuke. By a margin of 31-9, the Republican-controlled Senate voted against the president's wishes. They rejected the gerrymandered maps. It wasn't even close. It was a landslide defeat for the coercion tactics. So, how did the president handle this public loss? This is where we get into the psychology of power. Immediately after the vote, Trump held a press conference in the Oval Office. When asked about the defeat in Indiana, a defeat of a project he had personally posted about repeatedly, he tried to rewrite history in real time. He told reporters, "I wasn't working on it very hard. I barely paid attention to it." If you look at the timeline closely, this statement is objectively false. We have the posts, we have the threats, we have the visits from surrogates. But facing a humiliating loss, the strategy shifted to denial. He then pivoted back to attacking Senator Rod Bray, saying, "I heard he was against it and probably lose his next primary. I hope he does." This denial might seem like just typical political spin, but it masks a much darker reality of what happened behind closed doors to get to that 31-9 vote. Because while the president was claiming he wasn't involved, the men and women in the Indiana State House were facing threats that went far beyond politics. It's easy to look at politicians as distinct from the rest of us, people in suits making deals. But we need to talk about the human moment that defined this entire saga. Indiana State Senator Greg Walker, a conservative Republican, spoke out after the vote. He didn't talk about maps or statistics. He talked about fear. In an incredibly emotional interview, Senator Walker described the wave of intimidation he and his colleagues faced. He wasn't just talking about angry emails. He was referring to the kind of vitriol that makes you fear for your family's safety. He shared a story about holding a 5-month-old baby, his granddaughter, or a relative, and breaking down in tears. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he asked himself how he could ever look that child in the eye if he accepted that intimidation is a normal part of governance. He said, "I began to cry as I thought about the future for that child where we accept that intimidation is normal. I shall refuse the offer for the sake of that child." Why does this emotional testimony matter to you, the viewer? Because this is the 5-alarm fire for the rule of law. When lawmakers are voting not based on what is best for their constituents, but based on whether they will be safe from threats or whether their state will lose highway funding, we have left the realm of a democratic republic. We are entering the territory of mob rule. Legally, the separation of powers between the federal executive branch and state legislatures is designed to prevent exactly this kind of coercion. The federal government cannot commandeer a state legislature. They cannot force a state to enact a specific law by holding unrelated funding hostage. That was established in Supreme Court precedents like NFIB versus Sebelius. But here we saw a blatant attempt to bypass those constitutional guardrails. The fact that Heritage Foundation and allies felt comfortable making these threats publicly shows a degradation of legal norms that should worry every American, regardless of who you voted for. If you are still with me, this next part matters the most, because this behavior in Indiana wasn't an isolated incident. It was just one symptom of a much larger, more chaotic approach to governance that was on full display in that same Oval Office meeting. If we zoom out from Indiana, the press conference where Trump denied his involvement offered a window into a broader pattern of erratic leadership that has real-world consequences for the economy and national security. During the same briefing, the president made claims that were, frankly, all over the map. He claimed that his first term had the greatest economy in history and that the current economy is blowing it away. Now, for anyone who remembers the economic collapse during the pandemic response or anyone currently paying high prices at the grocery store, this feels like gaslighting. But more importantly, he admitted that inflation was hitting record highs, yet took no responsibility for the policy decisions driving it. Then there was a bizarre exchange about Venezuela. The administration has been seizing oil tankers and ramping up aggression toward the country. When a reporter, from a friendly network no less, asked if the campaign against Venezuela was now about oil rather than just drugs, the answer was a masterclass in deflection. He pivoted immediately to immigration, claiming Venezuela is emptying prisons and mental institutions into the U.S., a claim that has been repeatedly debunked or lacks evidence in the data. But the underlying message was clear. The policy is driven by whatever narrative fits the moment, whether it's oil or immigration, regardless of the consistency. Finally, we heard from Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who stood there claiming that the U.S. must maintain a pass-fail lead over China in artificial intelligence. He talked about how we cannot let China's AI get around our defenses. Here is why this is ironic and legally concerning. This administration recently authorized the transfer of advanced H-200 chips, some of our most sensitive intellectual property, to China. National security experts have warned that this exact technology could be used to undermine U.S. defenses. So, on one hand, you have the Treasury Secretary saying we must defeat China in tech. On the other hand, the administration is handing them the keys to the castle. When you put it all together, the coercion in Indiana, the denial of responsibility, the conflicting foreign policy, and the national security risks, you see a governing style defined by impulse rather than law. The failure in Indiana proves that this style has limits. Even within the president's own party, there are people willing to say enough. The 31 Republican senators in Indiana who voted no didn't just stop a map, they stopped a precedent. They established that federal bullying has a breaking point, so let's recap. A president tried to strong-arm a state legislature into bending the law for political gain. He used proxies to threaten the livelihood and infrastructure of millions of people. And when the local leaders stood tall, motivated by principle and the future of their children, he pretended he never cared in the first place. At its core, this story is about the resilience of the system, but also its fragility. The system worked this time because 31 people in Indiana decided that their oath of office mattered more than their political loyalty. But the fact that such extreme threats, cutting off road money, withholding disaster relief, were put on the table is a scar that won't heal quickly. It reveals a mindset where the rule of law is viewed as an obstacle to be bulldozed rather than a foundation to be protected. I want to hear from you on this. Put aside your party affiliation for a second. If a Democratic president threatened to cut off funding for your state's schools or hospitals unless the state passed a specific law he wanted, would you accept that? Where do you draw the line between political pressure and abuse of power? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read them to understand what you are seeing on the ground. If you found this analysis helpful, if you appreciate breaking down the actual events rather than just the headlines, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. It helps me keep this channel independent and focused on the facts that impact your rights and your wallet. I'm Daniel Kershaw. Thank you for watching and stay vigilant.